I'm Marielle Smith and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at Michigan State University. And today I'm going to be talking to you about or presenting a remote sensing perspective on the effects of water table depth on forest structure and functioning. So here in this talk we're going to explore how Amazon forest structure varies across water table depth gradients. And we're going to look both at spatial and seasonal patterns of forest structure. Forest structure is the physical manifestation of tree demographic processes and is mechanistically linked to key ecosystem functions. Therefore, understanding spatial and temporal patterns and drivers of forest structural variation may provide insights into mechanisms of forest responses to climatic changes. So firstly, let's go into the spatial hypothesis for forest structure. And that is that shallow rooting depths and unstable waterlogged soils of shallow water table depth regions give rise to higher tree mortality and turnover rates and forest structures, that has been highlighted in a paper led by Tayani Souza recently, the increased mortality and biomass turnover rates of shallow water table depth forests. And with these, sort of higher, more dynamic forests, they're going to have structures that are more characteristic of younger, early successional dynamic forests. And so some of those structural characteristics that we'll expect to see will be lower canopy heights, higher gap fractions, and more bottom-heavy leaf area profiles, by which I mean the leaf area will be concentrated towards the lower canopy heights. Now let's look at the seasonal dynamics hypothesis that we're going to test. And this is that the seasonal patterns of vertical leaf area distributions in shallow water table depth forests will be opposite to that of deep water table depth forests. Since the period most favorable for growth, that is to say the growth window, is during the dry season for shallow water table depth forests, while it's in the wet season for deep water table depth forests. So here we're looking at an image of the wet season, and you can see that, this is when tree growth tends to happen in the deep water table depth forest, but the soil anoxia suppresses growth in the shallow water table depth region. The soil is inundated with water, so it's not really great for growth. On the other hand, during the dry season, some of the soil has dried out and there's limited aeration, so that's when tree growth tends to happen in the shallow water table depth regions. For the spatial analysis, we put together a very large database of ground-based LiDAR, and this is collected across the Amazon basin, and this is part of an international collaboration across many institutions. We have about 370 plots, and the plots are distributed across large-scale environmental gradients across the Amazon. So within this large database, we are lucky to have a couple of sites where we have multiple measurements, specifically taking every month, so we can look at this seasonal question. We already published the data from one of the sites, which is a deep water table depth site, quite a seasonal site with a 5-month-long dry season, called Kilometer 67 in the Tapajos National Forest. This was published in 2019 in the New Phytologist. And then one of the other sites with data collected by Diogo Rosa and Dalton Doval, with Bruce Nelson advising at IMPA. This is data they collected over a year, monthly data, and this is a less seasonal site with both shallow and deep water table depth regions. So basically we're going to compare the seasonality of these two different sites. So for both the spatial and the seasonal studies, we derived metrics of forest structure from the LiDAR data, just showing you some of the common ones in this diagram. Sorry, so this is a leaf area profile, that's quite important. which is the average leaf area at each height in the forest. And for the seasonal study, we also so we looked at the dynamics within the upper canopy and the lower canopy, and they were just distinguished based on a height above the ground, 20 meters. But then we also looked at the dynamics within so-called photic layers. And these are different distances away from the local canopy surface, where layer 1 is the highest light layer, and that's wherever it occurs, even in the lower canopy. We're looking at the surface layer wherever it occurs. And then the understory is this deep red color. And so that's always has leaf layers above it. So firstly, let's look at the spatial results. So we assess relationships between a number of key structural metrics and 12 focal environmental variables. And we did find that water table depth is a significant predictor of forest structural metrics. As you can see here, it's positively correlated to mean canopy height and negatively correlated to leaf area index. In addition, water table depth distinguished the leaf area profiles of forests. And as we expected, the shallow water table depth forests tend to have a more bottom-heavy profile, and they're shorter. And the deep water table depth regions are taller and tend to have a more developed upper canopy. But I just should say the most important predictor, and this is a paper in preparation, was soil fertility in terms of predicting forest structure. Now let's look at the seasonal dynamics. Firstly, I'm going to present work that we already published in 2019 for the deep water table depth site, kilometer 67. So at this site, in the second half of the dry season, which is shown in this red box, which was a period of greatest water stress, we see an increase in upper canopy leaf area and a decrease in lower canopy leaf area. And indeed, these canopy layers are strongly anti-correlated. Next, let's look at the deep water table regions of kilometer 34, this less seasonal site. And so what we see is an increase in upper canopy leaf area, just like in kilometer 67, but no change in the lower canopy. And finally, looking at the seasonal dynamics within the shallow water table depth regions of kilometer 34, we see no change in the upper canopy, but an increase in the lower canopy. And when we look at the regressions between the upper and lower canopy levels, we find a very similar thing to kilometer 67 at the deep water table depth regions of kilometer 34, where these layers are strongly anti-correlated. But they're not related in the shallow water table depth regions. So the next thing we did in our 2019 paper was to separate the lower canopy into the photic layers that I explained to you before. And so again, both of these layers here are for the lower canopy. But the first one is just the leaf area at the very surface. So we could be, basically we're looking at trees, small trees in gaps, whereas the one underneath is all of the understory. And so when we did this, we found that the loss of leaf area from the lower canopy during the dry season was really driven by a loss of leaf area at the lower canopy surface, small trees in gaps. And meanwhile, at the same time, there was an increase in the understory. So let's look at how this applies to the deep water table depth regions of kilometer 34. So at the lower surface, there's no change, but just like at kilometer 67, there's an increase in the understory. So similar responses to 67, in addition to seeing an increase in the upper canopy. And so with the upper canopy increase, we conclude in our paper that this is because, or perhaps because large trees have deep roots, and they've been shown to be able to access deep soil water even during periods of water stress. And as I said, like kilometer 67, we see an increase in the understory, and the lower surface and the understory are significantly correlated, even though the lower surface doesn't show significant change during the El Nino dry season. And so, yeah, we could conclude the same as we did in the 2019 paper, that that these different layers are experiencing contrasting microenvironments, and perhaps also have trees with different functional strategies. Now let's look at the kilometer 34. So what we have is an indication of opposite responses to the deep water table depth sites. Specifically, we have an increase in the lower canopy that appears to be driven by an increase in the lower canopy surface layer. And the upper versus lower canopy are not anti-correlated or in any way correlated, and the lower surface and the understory layers are also not related. So this makes me wonder whether these less pronounced differences the lack of correlations are due to perhaps less pronounced differences in the rooting depths of large and small trees in shallow water table depth regions, and perhaps also less pronounced difference in the microenvironments and tree functional strategies. So to conclude, we find that water table depth explains spatial variations in forest structure across the Amazon basin. It's an important predictor of mean canopy height and leaf area index, and it distinguishes forests based on their vertical leaf area distributions. And this is all evidence in support of the hypothesis that shallow forests have, shallow water table depth forests have structures characteristic of more dynamic, younger forests. And this, if you remember, is expected due to shallow root anchoring in these regions and associated high turnover rates. Preliminary results that I'm presenting today suggest that shallow and deep water table depth forests exhibit opposing seasonal leaf area patterns, and this was especially sort of obvious in the lower canopy surface layer, which increases in leaf area during the dry season in the shallow regions but decreases in the deep regions. Possibly this is due to the microclimate of the shallow forest surface layer being more favorable to growth, because maybe it dries out faster and then has a longer growth window than the understory layer. But many more insights to come from our large National Science Foundation grant led by Scott Stark, Flavia Costa, and Juliana Schetti. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge the partner institutions in this work and the funding sources, and I'd take any questions. Thank you very much.